Okay, thanks Peter, and thanks for the opportunity from the Grain Centre today to talk about my thesis results. So what do we know about grazing of wheat crops, which has been the focus of my studies for the last 3 years? Well, we know that they can be grazed and they're of high nutritive value, being high in digestibility and protein values usually over 20%. We also know that with good management that comparable yields with spring grazing spring wheat can be achieved, and in particular with removing livestock prior to stem elongation. And probably the key point from a grazing perspective is their ability to fill the winter feed gap in terms of their availability during a period of the year when pasture growth rates are typically slow. However, from a grazing livestock perspective, there are some issues, and in particular, a couple that have been identified are the inconsistent performance of young livestock grazing wheat, and also and the impetus behind my research, anecdotal reports of high ewe losses on grazing wheats. So in relation to the inconsistent performance of young livestock, Dove and McMullen had a paper in 2009 on this subject, and what they identified was that by supplementing growing lambs with magnesium and sodium, that the growth rate of those lambs was significantly increased. Now, a couple of key points about this is that the magnesium levels in the forage itself weren't extremely low, they were marginal compared to the lamb requirements. What these researchers identified was, in particular, that they thought that the magnesium, that the low sodium and high potassium levels in the feed was actually resulting in a depression in magnesium absorption. Quite interestingly, that more recently they've identified that they don't always get a response in the lambs grazing wheat when they provide this supplement, as they showed in a more recent paper. So what about ewes? Well, for ewes in a winter lambing system where you're wanting to graze late pregnant or lambing ewes on a wheat crop, we know that the ewes have very high requirements, and in particular we need to be aware of the calcium and magnesium requirements of ewes during this period, because ewes in late pregnancy in particular are more susceptible to the metabolic diseases of hypocalcaermia and pregnancy toxaemia. And during lactation, hypomagnesaemia, also known as grass tetany, becomes important, particularly around the peak of lactation. So here we have the mineral profile of wheat forage. The green bars here show the calcium, magnesium and sodium content of wheat forage from one of my field trials down at Balldale. And you can see here that compared to the requirements of ewes during pregnancy and lactation, that in particular for calcium and sodium, the levels in the wheat forage is quite low. For magnesium, similar to with lambs, the levels are marginal to low. So how do we approach this? Well, started off with 2 field trials with ewes lambing down on wheat in 2010 and 11. First one at Balldale was using merino ewes, and there was a mixture of single and twin bearing ewes. And the second trial at Cookadinya used Coopworth merino cross ewes, and they were all twin bearing. And the idea behind these trials was to test the effect of providing a basic mineral supplement to ewes grazing on the wheat, which was designed to rectify the deficiencies in the wheat forage in terms of supplying magnesium, calcium and sodium. So we had a 2:1 ratio of magnesium oxide such as Cosmag, lime, calcium carbonate and salt. So what did we see? Well, in terms of monitoring the ewes, we looked at the ewes, monitoring their condition score, and within a subsample of ewes we were also taking regular blood samples during both trials to monitor the calcium and magnesium levels in serum. So what we saw was that at Balldale, out of the nearly 300 ewes we had there, we only had 3 mortalities. None of those were primarily due to metabolic disease, and in the 60 ewes, 30 single and 30 twin bearing that we were monitoring, taking regular blood samples from, we only had 8 ewes with one measurement of low blood calcium, and only 1 ewe that had one measurement of low blood magnesium. At Cookadinya, we had no ewes died, and there was only a single case of low blood calcium. And in terms of supplying the supplement to the ewes, there was no apparent effect on the ewes from feeding this supplement. In terms of the lambs, we also monitored the lambs in terms of birth weight, lamb growth rate and survival. What we did find here was a significant difference with a small increase in the growth rate of twin-born lambs at Balldale. However, there was no effect on the single-born lambs. However, when we repeated this experiment at Cookadinya, the growth rate of the single-born lambs at Balldale was up about 325 grams per head per day. The Cookadinya twin-born lambs there, the crossbred Coopworth Merino lambs, they were growing at over 300 grams per head per day. So not far off what we achieved with the singles in the previous year, and there was no effect from supplementation. There was very high survival rate among those twin-born lambs as well. So no apparent effect from supplementation at Cookadinya in that second year. So given that we know that that the wheat is low in calcium and low in and potential issues for magnesium absorption, and the potential effect this then has for hypocalcaermia and hypomagnesaemia, the next step was to then go and say, well, okay, we're hearing reports of producers having some high losses on wheat. What's going on? So I went out and asked them. We had 2 surveys. We had a questionnaire sent out to the mixed farming districts within the Hume LHPA, and then a comparative survey of some of those respondents where we conducted a semi-structured interview. So results from the questionnaire survey, which was the one posted out within the district, we had of the respondents, 43% identified that they had grazed late pregnant or lambing ewes in at least one season, and lambing ewes on dual purpose wheat in at least one season between 2005 and 2010. Of those who hadn't been using dual purpose wheat, the most common reason was that they weren't actually growing dual purpose wheat, hence they couldn't graze their ewes on there. Also, I think about 25% had a lambing time not conducive to grazing late pregnant and lambing ewes on wheat, and about 15% were concerned about the ewe health issues. You can see there that in 2010 that there was actually quite a high number of the respondents identified that they were supplying some kind of supplementation to the ewes, whether that be in terms of hay, mineral supplements or grain. The most common ewe health issues identified in 2010 were dystocia, so lambing difficulties, pregnancy toxaemia, and foot abscess and grass tetany, so hypomagnesaemia. And then we also asked for the period from 2005 to 2009 whether producers had experienced any issues, health issues or high mortality rates that they considered to be higher than their standard levels. And 30% of the respondents who had grazed their late pregnant and lambing ewes on wheat during that period identified that in at least one season that had occurred. So I then interviewed some of the respondents to gather more details on what had happened around the period of grazing these lambing ewes on wheat. And we had, in terms of the experiment itself, it was comparative analysis between those who identified that their losses were what they considered to be abnormally high, and those that who considered that their ewe losses were in the normal range. And within that high loss group, the average of ewe losses in the particular mob that they focused on was 8.6%, so quite high and significantly higher than identified in the normal range. And a key point of that was that metabolic diseases, because of the low numbers, we grouped metabolic disease under one heading for the analysis, and metabolic diseases were important where these high losses were occurring. In terms of management practices associated with grazing on wheat, the producers who hadn't experienced high losses or identified that their losses were within a normal range, suggested that the condition of their ewes going into that grazing period was higher than in the group where high losses had occurred. And in addition to this, mineral supplements were important. We can see in this figure here, this shows the proportion of producers within each group who were supplying a supplement that included calcium, magnesium or sodium. We can see that there was a significant difference in the proportion of producers between the two groups supplying magnesium and sodium to the ewes, and the difference wasn't significant for calcium. However, the small numbers make it difficult to get a statistical difference, but you can see there was more producers who hadn't experienced high losses who were also supplying calcium. So in conclusion, from this, ewes can be grazed on dual-purpose wheat during late pregnancy and lambing, and producers in this region are certainly doing that. However, we need to be aware with this practice that ewes may be more susceptible to metabolic diseases because of those deficiencies in the wheat forage. The recommendation is to supply ad libitum access to mineral supplements that include magnesium, sodium and calcium. And it's also important given that metabolic diseases are a key cause of losses when grazing wheat, is to undertake practices that minimise the potential for these, such as having the ewes in adequate condition score and minimising stressors. And stresses such as management or handling of the ewes shortly prior to lambing were important in individual cases during the survey, not enough to actually identify them statistically, but for individual farmers that was certainly an issue. So the next step for my studies has been to look at what does this mean for the system. So what I've been doing of late is modelling the use of dual-purpose wheats for mixed farms that are looking to lamb during the winter. And I've been using a program called OzFarm, which combines, for those of you who are familiar with the modelling programs, combines the grass grow model for animal model and also it's just escaped me, but the cropping APSIM model for cropping. So it combines the two and actually allows you to sow and graze crops and stubble. So what the basic system that I've modelled is a mixed farm with 400 hectares of loose and sub pasture being grazed rotationally by a mob of ewes. And this farm has, I'm modelling a portion of the farm, and this farm has the potential to, they're growing wheat, the potential that wheat is dual-purpose wheat and it can be grazed by those ewes during the winter period. The parameters I put around grazing of the wheat was that ewes could go onto the wheat once the wheat accumulated 850 kilos dry matter per hectare, and they were removed either when the crop reached stem elongation, the crop was eaten down to 600 kilos dry matter per hectare, or we reached the late August period. So I'll quickly skip through this, but this is basically what I was looking at: a medium merino enterprise joined to a terminal sire, replacements purchased in, And for the purposes of this exercise, to keep it simple, an lamb sold at 18 weeks, so a store lamb enterprise. We identified a stocking rate of 10 ewes per hectare as optimal based on a August lambing with no crop available, and that was the stocking rate which basically over the long term kept the average condition score of ewes between 2.75 and 3.25. And I used that same stocking rate across the winter months. And based on that stocking rate, used an area of wheat available of 350 hectares, which gave a similar stocking rate to what I've been using in trials, and what we'd identified through the surveys was typical for the region. And ewes, I didn't do any production feeding, same as Michael discussed earlier. However, ewes were fed to maintain condition score above 2, and then during the last trimester to try and ensure that condition score was above 2.5 coming into lambing. So some of the results from this, and they're quite clear, that having that crop available in the system, the weaning percentage was certainly high. You can see that difference there is about sort of 2 to 3%. Difference when the crop's available, and that's on the back of improved condition score. You can see the effect in that weaning graph there of lambing time. The conception rate for a June lambing is typically lower. However, that's been balanced out here, or actually more than balanced out here, by the higher mortality rates that the model accounts for a July lambing period. So we can see here the average wean weight when crops were included was higher than when the crop wasn't available for use, when the crop wasn't made available for use. The average sale weight, again, was improved by the inclusion of crop. And overall, the kilograms of lamb at a median age of 18 weeks per hectare of pasture, so that 400 hectare of pasture area, was certainly higher for when crop was available. And I think the difference there in June is about 17%, reducing to about 1% in the mid-August lambing. And so for the parameters I've put in, I used data from 2001 to 2009 for the gross margin analysis, with a supplement value of $250 per tonne for grain. And you can see here that consistently having that crop available for that winter period makes a large difference to your gross margin at the stocking rate of 10. So in conclusion from the modelling, it suggests that making an area of crop available for winter lambing ewes to graze increases production, and there's two sides to this. Firstly, ewes are over the longer term are in better condition score, and secondly, you have that deferred grazing of pasture, so that you've then got more pasture available post grazing the wheat for the ewes and lambs, and then after weaning for the lambs. Excuse me. Importantly, I guess from a management perspective, and for producers looking to lamb down on crop, the median date, I use the Wagga weather data set, so that's obviously for directly here from 1970 to 2010, that the crop reached that 850 kilograms per hectare level, at which time I put the ewes onto the crop in the model, around in early July. So that July lambing period, 50% of the years would meet that requirement. Obviously you can, and I showed a Balldale where I started actually grazing the crop at 500 kilos per hectare, and it actually at the stocking rate I had worked up and then sat around the 850 kilos per hectare level. You can, if you needed to, put them on at a lower level, but for this exercise 9th of July was the date. And under the grazing rules that I had there, on average the sheep were grazing about 50 days on crop, and so that obviously was substantial in terms of giving the pasture a rest, and that's actually in line with the results from my survey as well, what producers were achieving. So that's the results from my thesis. I'd like to thank my supervisory team and Jan Levart and the Humel HPA for their assistance with the survey. The Drum and Holm families as excellent collaborators. It's fantastic to have people wanting to be involved in research and willing to allow researchers like myself to work within their operation. And I had funding, and very thankful for the funding from Australian Wool Education Trust, New South Wales Rural Assistance Authority and the Future Farm Industry CRC. So thank you.